Welcome to our sixth episode of One Work, Five Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
Again, thank you as usual for having me on this sunny Sunday afternoon.
And I see we have a special guest.
Who's that? Oh, that's, you mean my little mutt here, Jefferson. Yeah, little Thomas Jefferson, who's cute and he's a great watchdog, but he has none of the wisdom of our third president. That's all right. I still love him. He's a good boy.
Maybe he'll write his own declaration.
Maybe a Declaration of Independence from me. He's tried to get away several times. So.
Oh, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Dr. Holowchak. He's a retired professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, and Camden and Ohio University. He's also the editor of Journal of Thomas Jefferson and His Time, and author, editor of over 20 published books and over 100 essays on Thomas Jefferson. And you'll be able to find his list of books in the video description. With our show, One Work, Five Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. And today's special 6th episode is on Thomas Jefferson's first love. Ooh, something we really never talk about. We'll discuss his letter with John Page, dated December 25th, 1762. Woohoo. First, allow me to give you a little background about John Page, with whom Jefferson was corresponding. John Page was born April 28, 1743. He lived in Gloucester County near the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. At William and Mary, he was the same age as and best friends with Thomas Jefferson, and both graduated in 1763. During the Revolutionary War, he raised and funded a regiment for the Virginia state militia from his country and rose to the rank of colonel. He would be lieutenant governor of Virginia, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, member of the U.S. Congress, and like Jefferson, governor of Virginia. Wow. There would be some 133 letters in the correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and Page. The first was this 1762 letter to Page, and Page's final letter to Jefferson in 1808, the year of the latter's death. Are you ready, Dr. Holowchak?
As ready as I can here.
Are you ready, Jeffy?
He's staying warm on my lap.
Oh, good. Okay, question.
Too warm. He just jumped off right now.
Question number 1. The letter to Rebecca Burwell comprises regarding Rebecca Burwell comprises 4 paragraphs, the first of which is a lengthy 714 words complaint that his fate is comparable to the biblical Job. What is going on?
Well, if you know your Bible, I'm not a biblical scholar, but Job, in the book of Job, he is someone who is a good man, a wealthy man, has a good life. He's tested by the God of the Old Testament. He loses his wealth, he loses his children, and finally he loses his health. And Jefferson complains here in the letter to John Page, that I am in a similar situation. Jefferson says, I am surrounded by enemies. The devil visited me last night, capital D. To compound his misadventures, or the misadventures of last night, rats came in, ate his silk garters, ate some 6 minuets that he was a happy and ardent musician, but they didn't eat his pocketbook, which was in his vest pocket near a foot from his head, he says. And he goes on to say, well, I love this line. Well, he's almost ready to forgive everything that's happened. He says, rats will be rats. Now they're going to eat stuff. And of course, and it tells you a little bit about the conditions of living at the time. Wouldn't have been uncommon for rats to be running around the house today. We find it sort of disgusting, but he says, okay, that's okay. I can handle what the rats did, but something much worse happened that tried his patience, and that changed his life. There was a hole in the roof, and he says it's, Jefferson just can't say from a hole in the roof, water came down, fell atop my pocket watch and ruined the silhouette picture I had of Rebecca Burwell. Now, it's common that, do I have a watch available here? I do have one, okay? Got a pocket watch, and I have about 3 of these. I don't use them, but it would have been common for a young man or any kind of man to put the picture of, and this was practiced years later, even in the Old West, you put the picture of your beloved when pictures came. If you didn't, you'd put a silhouette in your watch and keep it with you. Okay. So the water, and he says, this water is a hole in the roof. He says, perpendicular over my watch. He's got to bring in frickin' mathematics, right? The way he thinks. He can't say water came in and fell. It's perpendicular over my watch. Who talks like that? Okay, the devil, he says, came and bored a hole over it on that purpose. Now, the silhouette is destroyed. The third problem he has is, okay, the rats came in, the water came down perpendicular over his watch, and now there's no silhouette of Burwell. So what's going to happen? He's got a vivid picture, he says, in his mind of Burwell, and he's going to be thinking of her so much that I can't. And he says, I won't be able to get through old Coke. He means Coke. Coke was Sir Thomas Coke, whose Institutes of the Laws of England was standard reading and training for law. That was the standard legal text of the day. So he won't be able to get through old Coke, he says. So that's the third thing, is that he's going to be thinking so much of his beloved Rebecca Burwell, he won't be able to do his required work.
Okay. I was wondering about that when I was reading the letter. Oh, if you only know what I was thinking. Question number 2. You customarily bid us to pay attention to Jefferson's prose. Is there anything in this early letter, one of the earliest surviving letters of Thomas Jefferson, that strikes you as noteworthy?
Is there anything? There are many things.
Okay.
And, like I said, I've written on this passage before, but I've never scoured it, like knowing we're going to do it. And I went through it this morning and scoured it and found it tells you a lot about his education at the time. Of course, he's at William and Mary, and William and Mary at time is not really, it's not like the University of Virginia would be years later, training people to be, prominent, either politicians or prominent citizens, scientists and so forth. The William and Mary was designed to give you a religious education for the most part. Jefferson was a different student, where he was intrigued by the natural sciences, by philosophy and things like that, and not so interested in the religious instruction. You could do that on your own. So right off the bat, what strikes the reader is his reference to Job. Okay, he's getting a religious education, so we've got certain references to Job in the Bible. So he's got to bring in, he's bringing in something of what he learned. Another thing, his reference to arithmetic and physics, Newtonian physics. Remember, he talks about the water coming down perpendicular over my watch. No one talks like that except Jefferson. Always got to arithmetize or geometrize everything. And then he says, when he's talking about, he says the subtle particles of water. This is something worth attended. The subtle particles of particles. Notice, because Newton says everything comprises, my cup is made up of atoms, everything comprises atoms. So he's talking about the particles of water with which the case was filled, had by their penetration so overcome the cohesion of the particles of the paper of which my dear picture and watch paper were composed, that in attempting to take them out, to dry them, good God, mens horet refer, my cursed fingers gave them such a rent as I fear I shall never get over. So mens horet refer, the mind is in horror, the mind recoils to think about it. You can't even think about this, what happened. He's talking about these subtle particles of water, the cohesion of the particles of the paper. The hell is going on here? You just say the picture got destroyed. It got wet and destroyed. When I tried to pick it up, I would see it was okay. It fell to pieces, but it's just no subtle particles of water, and it overcame the cohesion, right? So you get appeals to arithmetic, and Jefferson would sort of be like this the rest of his life. You get a lot of quotes from the Latin. He says, quantum mutatis ab illo, which roughly means, and I had to go through translation, go back to my Latin again. I haven't had this stuff in 30 years. The mind, not the mind, but that's the quantum mutatis ab illo, in such a way, how changed are things from what they once were. In other words, a little while ago, everything was cool. I went to bed last night, everything's fine, and now, catastrophe.
Yeah.
And then he says, this other thing, mens horet refer, the mind bristles at the thought of even thinking of this. Even thinking of it causes me tensions. And then he goes on to say, multis fortunae vulneribus percussus huic uni me imparem sensi et penitus succubui, which means something like, I translated as struck through and through with many wounds by fortune. This is very Seneca. You can tell he's reading Seneca. Seneca, one of my favorite Stoics, always writes of the tela fortunae, the shafts of fortune that hit us. And so he says, struck through and through with the many wounds by fortune, I felt unequal to this task, and succumbed thoroughly. The rats did what they did. It didn't bother me. That's cool. But that the water, through its perpendicularity, destroys my picture, I'm destroyed by this. So emotionally. Then he has a quote from the Greek, ton ontan ta men hemen ta duk hemen, again, which means something like, of things that are, some are mine, some are not mine. Again, a very Stoic, this is why I always call Jefferson a Stoic, even if he calls himself an Epicurean. Epicurus never said anything like this.
Oh, okay.
The Stoics had something called oikeiosis, which I like. We get a word economy from it.
Oh.
But oikeiosis oikos meant house in Greek. Oikeiosis meant what is rightfully my own. Mm-hmm. And part of the large part of Stoic ethics, if not the whole of it, really refers to oikeiosis, knowing what is properly yours and what is not yours. Mm-hmm. Notice how Jefferson talks about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are, according to oikeiosis, those are things every person owns. Uh-huh. So he's talking about some things are mine, some things are not mine. Uh-huh. And he's probably referring to fate. Fate, what do you have in store for me? Is she going to be mine? Is she not going to be mine? Then he goes on to talk about, I hope that goodness in the world is repaid by goodness in this world, but if not, maybe in the afterworld. This is a case where he talks about the afterlife. Is he being serious or not? I don't think so. He talks about the afterlife much in many of his writings. He wasn't much of a believer in it, but he's being bombarded with the education at William and Mary, so he's going to talk about these things.
And he was young at the time too, right? How old was
he? He's what, 62, so he's 19, right?
Okay, so, and maybe his ideas changed over time.
I don't think so. I mean, when we get to that, I try to show that even when young, he didn't. There's evidence he didn't believe in an afterlife. So really, and it's possible that it's possible. I would say this, at least he might have had an open mind at this time. I don't think he did, but at later life, it just closed off. He says, are there so few inquietudes tacked to this momentary life of ours that we must need be loading ourselves with 1,000 more? I love when people use must need. We must and need pretty much redundant, but anyway, my commentary, but so inquietudes, mental things, that mental botherations. So I mean, we have so many things that perturb us. Do I need another one?
Right.
There are thousands all the time.
Yeah.
It goes on to say, is there any such thing as happiness in this world? No. And as for admiration, I'm sure the man who powders most, perfumes most, embroiders most, and talks most nonsense is most admired. And he talks of these people being monkeys. So he's got this soft spot. If I wasn't such a scholar, such an intellectual, and I took care of powdering myself, make sure my wig was perfectly powdered and dressed nicer and spoke with more refinement, I'd be able to pick up the girls, right? So the last thing I'll say is, so we get Greek, Latin, we get passages from the Bible, we get philosophical passages where it's reflecting upon the meaning of life can last. What you said struck you, we get emotionality. We get, we tend to think, and we should always think of Jefferson as a profoundly rational person. He was. But in my book, Thomas Jefferson, Psychobiography of American Lion, I discuss Jefferson's emotional self. This letter, as well as other things, as well as his violently emotional response when his wife died, his 1886 love letter on October 13th to Maria Cosway, which he pours his soul out, shows that Jefferson was an unusually emotional person who did not, in my estimation, he just never learned how to deal with his emotions. So he kept them under a lid.
Okay.
I think he sublimated, as in Freudian terms. So he couldn't really, if he allowed himself emotional expression, it's just like a person saying, well, I'm going to have one piece of pizza because I really like pizza. I'll have one. And the whole pizza's gone. And he has to learn how to deal with that. If I let my emotions out, I go nuts. So how can I deal with that? So he learns to deal with it by not letting them out, by writing, by sublimating, and all sorts of things. I think by the time I argued that it's a wonderful book, it's just godly overpriced, he winds up sublimated. He winds up, he's so, consider that passage that I translated. It's struck through and through with many wounds. By fortune, I felt unequal to this one, and I succumbed thoroughly. I gave up. So we get we get the sense that you read that at first and you said, well, this is nuts.
I did.
He's pouring himself out to John, and the first thing you can get is this guy is sort of out of control.
Yeah, I did.
Such a rash, and that's what you need to get when you read this the right way.
Definitely, after listening to your answers to the questions, I will reread the letter and see it completely differently now. Yeah. Question number 3. Okay. Was Rebecca Burwell, at least, what do we know about her and her relationship to Jefferson?
She was born 3 years after Jefferson. She died in 1806. Jefferson, when he writes this letter, if you look, he writes it from Fairfield.
Okay.
Now, I'm trying to figure out what that means. It's not fair. There's a Fairfield, Virginia. He didn't write it from there that I know of. Rebecca lived at Fairfield Plantation in Gloucester County, which was near William and Mary, which is near where John Page was born. Okay. So is he writing it from Fairfield, Fairfield Plantation? That doesn't seem right. It must be there was another Fairfield that was linked with his sister Mary and her husband. So it's probably writing from that place. I'm not sure of that, but we know she's 3 years his junior. We know that they met at William and Mary when Jefferson was 19. Jefferson falls irretrievably in love. She comes from a very wealthy, influential, one of the most influential families. So again, Jefferson, is not from one of the most influential families, but his father was a self-made man, and he is a gentleman who was going to school, getting an education. So he's hanging around the gentry. That's about all I know about Rebecca Burwell. I don't know too much about her. Maybe there's a lot more to be said by other people, but there was enough to do to prepare for this letter without scouring every scrap of information I could get on Rebecca.
Yeah, well, which leads me to question number 4. I'm very curious to know what happened between them. I know you said there are references in 2 other letters, but I'm curious to know what came of his love for her.
Well, this is, if you thought the first letter was nuts, what I will read through slowly, 2 passages from 2 subsequent letters.
Okay.
And you'll really realize he really was nuts when it came to women. He was as awkward, as clumsy, as gauche as any young man could be. He was nothing. He was no Don Juan. On the first letter is on October 7th, 1763. Okay. He's talking about an event at the Raleigh Tavern by William and Mary College in Williamsburg, Virginia. That's where people would go to hang out, for events. So they're at the Raleigh Tavern, and he writes in this letter, and let me read it. I have it on screen. He writes to John, in the most melancholy fit that ever any poor soul was, I sit down to write to you. Last night, as merry as agreeable company and dancing with Belinda in the Apollo room of the Raleigh Tavern could make me, I never could have thought the succeeding sun would have seen me so wretched as I am now. I was prepared to say a great deal. I had dressed up in my own mind such thoughts as occurred to me in as moving language as I know how, and expected to have performed in a tolerably creditable manner. But good God, when I had the opportunity of venting them, a few broken sentences uttered in great disorder and interrupted with pauses of uncommon length were the 2 visible marks of my strange confusion. So you have an idea what's going on in that passage?
A little bit. It sounds like he's overwhelmed with feeling.
Yes, and what does he want to say to her? Can you guess?
I'm afraid to. What does he want to say? You tell me.
Will you marry me?
So does he actually propose to her?
No, he doesn't. Not according to the letter. I was prepared to say a great deal. I had dressed up. He prepares everything in his mind. It can't be spontaneous. He's got to write it out like a mathematical formula. Such thoughts as occurred to me in his moving language. So he's writing the language out beautifully. He scripts it. And I suspect, if you want to propose to someone, maybe preparing in advance is a good thing, but scripting something, well, it's sort of artificial. Sort of. He wanted to perform. He says, when I had the opportunity of venting these thoughts, a few broken sentences uttered in great disorder and interrupted with pauses of uncommon length. So it's like, Rebecca, something I'd like to talk to you about. Pauses of uncommon length. So he, and then she, so why the uncommon length pauses? Now, people don't think too much about this. Might think of what's going on. He's very uneasy. She's probably giving him what back? What kind of feedback do you think she's giving him? Positive or negative?
Maybe indifference, or maybe she's not.
Indifference is negative feedback. It's the worst sort of feedback. If I want, if I give you hostility, that's fine. But if I'm trying to propose and your mind is wandering, you don't really, that. So I'm convinced that she's sending signals like you suggested, indifference back. He's serious about this, and she's changing the subject. That's why the long pauses is that, okay, you script something in anticipation of a certain reply. If that reply is not forthcoming, the next thing you script doesn't work.
Right.
It doesn't work. So that's what's going on in my mind. He's got, okay, I'm going to start off this way. I've got this, and I'm going to see what she says. And if I get, and then I'm going to say that and see what she says. And then, will you marry me? Everything's a disaster. So it shows you that, he's got to script everything. Like we said, he's so precise, perpendiculars.
Mm-hmm.
He's terribly uncomfortable around women. And she's, in my estimation, giving him not the sort of feedback that made the situation any more comfortable. So he never proposes. Okay, now the second letter he writes on January 19th, 1764, which is 3 months later, a little over 3 months later. He writes from Devilsburg, Virginia. Now, where's Devilsburg? Devilsburg is Williamsburg. He calls it Devilsburg, just like in the first letter, the devil is besieging me. He's having another panic attack.
Oh.
Now, Page writes him a letter, and Page says in the Latin, he's writing Latin, semper saltat, semper ridet, semper loquitur, semper solicitat, I should say, hard C in Latin, which means always dance, always ridet, always laugh, always speak clearly, locutors speak, always solicitat. Solicitat means something like rouse things up, stir things up. So always stir up the pot. And so he's, think about it. He says, dance, laugh, speak clearly, don't pause and stir up the pot. Go for it. You love the woman, get it. And Jefferson replies in his letter, and I'll read another line. He says, good God, it's impossible. And I go on to read, he says, I told you of our confab in the Apollo, that's the prior letter, but I believe I never told you that we had another occasion. I then opened my mind more freely and more fully. So he's going to talk to her, and he's more capable here. I mentioned the necessity of my going to England and the delays which would consequently be occasioned by that. I said in what manner I should conduct myself to then and explain my reasons, which appeared to give that satisfaction I could have wished. He tells her I need to go to England. In short, I managed in such a manner that I was tolerably easy myself without doing anything which could give Adnileb is Belinda backwards, and he spells it in Greek letters. Why he calls her Belinda, that's his pet name. So he's now putting it backwards. I talked about anything that could give Adnileb's friends the least umbrage were the whole that passed to be related to them. So he's speaking to her in a manner that where he's not going to say anything stupid or anything that could cause her grief or make her the laughing stock of her friends. I asked no question which would admit of a categorical answer. In other words, I didn't propose marriage, but assured Adnileb that such questions would one day be asked. In other words,
it's coming.
I'll ask the right questions. I can't do it right now because I got to go to England.
Yeah.
Then he says, my fate depends on Adnileb's present resolutions. By them I must stand or fall. If they are not favorable to me, it is out of my power to say anything to make them so, which I have not already said, so that a visit could not possibly be, you know how I like it when people say could not possibly be of the least weight.
Oh.
Could not be of the least weight, Jefferson will do just as well as could not possibly. Sorry, Tom. I have a thing against could not possibly. I don't know why.
Yeah.
All right. So what the hell's going on here? he's got another occasion. He's not going to propose marriage. He's going to tell her he's going to England. I have to go to England. Now, he has no trip to England planned. So why is he telling her he has to go to England? That's the first question. Do you have a clue or no?
Maybe to either, it could be for two reasons, to buy himself some time or to create a sense of urgency with her that he'll be gone.
Yeah,
And
good. I
maybe
think
that
that's
will-
what's going on, the latter.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, if she really loves me, if I tell her I'm going to England, what is she going to say?
She'll proclaim her love for him.
Yeah, and she'll say, no, Tom, you can't go. I can't live without you.
Right.
That doesn't happen. So poor Tom here, he doesn't want to offend. He says, I'm not going to ask anything that'll make, her look stupid, make her look stupid in front of her friends.
Right.
I suggest this is mere projection. I don't want to ask. He's not worried about offending Belinda in front of her friends. He's worried about offending himself or looking like a fool by asking a question and her saying, I'm not interested. And more, you get this notion of friends there. She is surrounding herself by a coterie of friends so that he can't ask the question.
Right.
I just thought of that. And it's sort of like, probably what's going on is she goes, oh, Tom's taking me to the dance. Stay close by.
Right.
He doesn't. So he says, no, I'm going to England. Right. Then he says, well, whatever happens, it's just, I'll leave it up to her.
Yeah.
Now, this is not a man who is very comfortable around women. Yeah. I'm going to let her decide my fate. And, you'd like to think, it tells you a lot about Thomas around women. You'd like to think, well, the guy's got to take charge and this is my life. I love this woman. I'm going to act. I don't care. If I get offended, I get offended. At least I'll have an answer.
Right.
He can't do that. Now, so it's up to her to make the first move. He won't. So he's distancing himself, with this England. It's a face-saving mechanism, as I said. We know at the same time that she was also being courted by a certain person named Jacqueline Ambler, who was a politician. And this letter is dated, I said, what, January 19. She would marry Jacqueline on May 24 of the same year. So he likely knows about that. So the idea here is that, okay, since his clumsy proposal that never happened, he's got this other thing. Well, I probably in the back of his mind, I know someone else is trying to court her. If she really loves me, I'll tell her I'm going to England and see what she says. And and she doesn't say anything, and we don't know what happened. So I mean, yeah, you feel for the guy, but he just was very, very clumsy. And I think it bespeaks the question when we talk at some point. We'll talk about Maria Cosway's letter. Was he was that clumsy around her as well? We'll have evidence of that. So it speaks the question of his courtship of his wife. What was it about Martha Wales Skelton that that made them such a match? Was she the take charge woman when he was clumsy around her? What made him more comfortable around her? So we have to ask that sort of question. We know nothing about her in their relationship, and I know nothing, but I do know. Okay, I mean, that's all I have to say about those two letters. I mean, so it's a disaster, is it not?
Oh, poor guy. Well, that leads me to question number 5. What do we learn about young Thomas Jefferson from this and the 2 other letters? From this letter and the 2 other letters?
Well, that, in fact, I've already answered. I can just sum, quickly. He was very emotional, overly emotional, clumsily emotional. And when he let his emotions out, he got into real trouble. This is why later in life he becomes a hyper-rational person, because that way he can have control over his life himself, and he cannot make a fool of himself.
Okay.
So at least that's what I think. I think he was clumsily emotional. When it's like saying, okay, let it out. You let it out. he would go around, now I gotta let her out, scream and run around run around Monticello 15 times around screaming, so he was just too out of control. We'll see that when we get to the head and heart letter. And then he was not only very unassertive when he was around women, I think he was petrified of women.
Oh, okay.
Women had a sort of, I've never said this before, but maybe women had a sort of aura about them that they had a control over him, about which he felt uncomfortable. He was powerless when it came to women. There was something about women that, especially those to whom he was attracted, that made him very uncomfortable and gave them the position of power. That begs the question, was Martha Jefferson a sort of take charge woman that recognized Jefferson, maybe she recognized Jefferson really loved her and she took charge and said, Thomas, yes, I feel the way you do. Let's go. Let me take you by the hand and I'll walk you through this.
Right.
She could have been and I suspect that that's a very likely thing that she was. I don't know. I suspect. I will just read one passage from the 1762 letter that shows you his. He writes at the end, he says, I would fain ask the favor. I would condescend to ask the favor of Miss Rebecca Burwell to give me another watch paper of her own cutting, to cut one out of her own, which I should esteem much more, though it were a plain round one, than the nicest in the world cut by other hands. However, I'm afraid she would think this presumption, that this would be presumption, in other words, after my suffering the other to get spoiled. If you can excuse me to her for this, I should be glad if you would ask her. So again, he said, he's thinking, well, her response is going to be that you let the other one get spoiled. Why am I going to give you another one? So she's going to be, she might get angry at him asking.
Right.
So in effect, he says, John, you can ask her for me, can't you? I mean, wow, put on, you want to say today, Tom, put on your big boy pants.
I was going to say that sounds a little emotionally immature.
Yes, he was emotionally immature, and I think he was always emotionally immature. And when we do further, I think he's going to mature in such a way where not only sublimation in Freudian terms is whether you're a Freudian or not, the idea of channeling your emotional energy into other things like doing exercising if you're sexually turned on, or instead of worrying about women for Tom, do a lot of writing, read a lot, go for a long walk, do things that are socially acceptable, instead of worrying about that. But I think he got to such an extent where he not only had mastery of his emotions, this is going to sound really weird, I think he was almost completely dispassionate later in life, where he just not only sublimated, he ceased to sublimate, he ceased to express himself emotionally. And I'll just give you one instance. He had built this wonderful dam in the Rivanna River that cost him several $1,000s to build. And Edmund Bacon, his overseer, came back when Jefferson was talking with someone else, and he said, Mr. Jefferson, there was a storm and rain, and he said the freshet, the flooding overwhelmed the dam and knocked it down. And you're talking about a time when Jefferson was many thousands of dollars in debt. Today would be over $1 million in debt, irretrievably in debt. And so several thousands of dollars he had put into this dam is destroyed. And you'd think for someone who's massively in debt by thousands of dollars, adding more thousands of dollars to the debt, you think it would drive him crazy. And Jefferson turns to his overseer and he says, well, we'll put in stones for now, and next year we'll just have to build a dam that the freshet can't break. Says it very calmly, and there are many instances of that type of behavior where things are going on, where most people would get irate or get flustered. He shows no emotionality whatsoever, and he's got complete mastery of his emotions in stoic-like fashion. You know, that wonderful stoic ideal of complete mastery of your emotions. I know that you so love, right?
No.
Anyway, I just think two things. He was overly emotional, couldn't control his emotion. He was terrible around women.
Oh, I apologize, everyone. I meant to have this picture of John Page when I was telling about him. Yes. Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak. I definitely, I hope everyone else has gained the insight into young Thomas Jefferson that I have today. And I really can't wait to reread the letter now that I have this background information. It shows how important background information is when we're looking at primary source documents and not just taking one document for what it says. There really is a history here. Thank you so much.
It also shows that, you know, historians can be of some use sometimes in helping us understand certain things that might be overwhelming.
We just have to be choosy.
Of any use today, but it, you know, maybe sometimes we do help.
We must be choosy with the historians we select to inform, and I've carefully chosen you. So. And thank you so much for this, for educating us today. I appreciate it so much. If you'd like to schedule Dr. Holowchak at your school, college, as a guest speaker, you can contact him at mholowchak@hotmail.com or his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson. Bring him home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Bye-bye.